We're all building the Summon Necromancer wrong. Might Aura is kind of a trap. Bramble might be the best in slot armor on a mercenary, and I think I have the data to prove it. Oh, and on top of that, it might include the Fire Golem as well. Y'all, this one gets kind of wild. So let me start off by saying, if you haven't seen my previous videos, we've been on a long trek of trying to prove whether or not Might or Thorns Aura is the best aura for an Act 2 mercenary on a Summon Necromancer. I've tested a lot. I'm going to be including a lot of different footage for a lot of different things, but I want to try to give people this data. I built some pretty graphs. I'm hoping to shed some light on this because I think I truly have found what the best combination is on your Summon Necromancer. So let's start with where our data is coming from. I was running a lot of different versions of the Necromancer, but the golden standard that we're using is the Act 2 Might Mercenary, Fortitude, Indarials, Infinity on the weapon, with skeletons and a random golem. We're using Diablo to generate these numbers, so we were killing players 8 Diablo consistently until we got these average kill times. And in about 30 seconds, an Act 2 mercenary with an entire setup of summoned skeletons and a random blood golem will kill Diablo in 30 seconds on average. So that was what we compared everything else against. Now the thing that was wild is our second test, where I took just a Necromancer with nothing but a golem and Thorns Aura. But how did I get access to Thorns Aura on a Necromancer without a mercenary? Running Edge Bow on swap and keeping a Bramble in our Heraldric Cube to put on before we fought Diablo, you gain access to a level 35 Thorns Aura. And then you throw on an amp damage to Diablo, and what you got were these kill speeds. Now remember, all I had was a Blood Golem and this weapon on swap with amp damage. And our kill times against players 8 Diablo, with him just eventually killing himself on Thorns damage alone, was 45 seconds to a minute. But we were often getting a kill speed of about 45 seconds, and that was with Diablo only attacking, I don't know, once in every 4 AI decisions. So the more often he hit, the faster he died. The less often he hit, the slower he died. But if I told you nothing but Thorns Aura and amp damage would kill players 8 Diablo only half as slow as an entire army of skeletons with an Act 2 mercenary with Crushing Blow, you probably would never believe that. And that's where the consideration of something called unit modifier comes in. And just to very quickly cover it, when something like a Primeval, so any of the Act bosses or an Uber, attacks a summon, they do 4 times their total damage. So if you have a high level Thorns Aura and a monster's doing 4 times damage to your summon, they're returning 4 times their base damage, which then gets multiplied by 14 from Thorns Aura. And then because you can cast amplify damage on it, that's another 1.55 multiplier. So I went through and I started testing other things to try to get a better idea of just how powerful this Thorns Aura was. The next 2 set of tests that I ran were an Act 1 mercenary, also using a Thorns setup, and an Act 2 mercenary with the Thorns Aura. The reason why the Act 1 mercenary was so important is because she could accomplish multiple things at the same time. 1, she could use an Ed rune word as well, and the Bramble armor so that the Necromancer didn't have to use it. This allowed us to continue to use Call to Arms to get battle command and battle orders. The other thing is that the Act 1 mercenary can use a G-Face to be able to apply Crushing Blow. The reason why that's so important is because it's really difficult to offset the value of Crushing Blow on Infinity. So using something like a G-Face, while it's not as effective from range, was still getting some procs in. There was a third secret benefit to using the Act 1 mercenary, which was a real problem that we eventually used the Fire Golem to solve. And that's manipulating Diablo's AI. The major problem with Diablo is that he has an aggro list, basically all monsters do, but there's a list of targets he'll try to go through to target. With an Act 2 mercenary in melee range, he was always targeting the Act 1 mercenary instead of my Clay Golem or my Blood Golem, or targeting me. And I noticed that he would target me if I cursed before I telestomped, and that was before any other of my summons or mercenary had time to generate aggro on him. The Act 1 mercenary stays out of melee range, so Diablo was more likely to attack our summons once I could get him to lose aggro on me. So with an Act 1 mercenary doing almost no damage herself except for every once in a while applying Crushing Blow, as well as offering a level 35 Thorns Aura. Our kill speed on Players 8 Diablo were averaging 30 to 35 seconds. It really depended on how quickly I could get him to lose aggro on me, and that was before we figured out the tech that we ended up using with the Fire Golem. And then lastly, we used an Act 2 Mercenary using the exact same gear, except we swapped him over to Thorns Aura as well. And you'll see that Act 2 Mercenary, with all of our summons up, with a Golem, was killing Diablo in about 35 seconds. But again, Diablo was targeting the Mercenary instead of our summons. The reason why that's so important is because against a Mercenary, Diablo only deals 2 times his base damage, whereas against our summons, he would be dealing 4 times damage. So you'll notice that it's slower than the Might Mercenary setup. It's similar to the Act 1 Mercenary setup, but he's attacking the Mercenary in this regard, as opposed to attacking our summons. And that's when someone in chat came up with the idea of how to more effectively manipulate Diablo's AI. The major problem is who manages to attack Diablo and generate aggro on him. When we teleport up and we cast our curse right away, we've generated aggro. And then he won't lose aggro until an equally as valuable target like a Golem or a Mercenary has successfully dealt damage to him since the last time that he made an AI decision. The problem that I was running into is that with the Mercenary in melee range, he was always dealing damage the fastest, so he was consistently generating aggro on Diablo. And the major problem there is because Golems don't really hit good, and they really don't do damage. So the damage on a Clay Golem, 70 damage, damage on a Blood Golem, 100 to 500, and then damage on a Fire Golem, 800 to 1000, definitely pretty good. Diablo has a lot of fire resistance though, but none of that is really going to compare to the nearly 2000 to 4000 damage that the Mercenary is doing. But a Fire Golem has one little extra bit to it that really changed how we're able to test this and how we could understand AI manip going forward, which will be relevant for the rest of the tests that we do. A Fire Golem has a Holy Fire tick damage. This will always apply to the target and it ticks every 2 seconds. And because the Fire Golem was generating aggro before anything else was on the screen, because the Holy Fire was applying first, he would generate and then hold aggro the entire time. So now we had the ability of using Thorns Aura and different mercenaries while making sure that Diablo would always be attacking a summoned monster to get the most out of the returned Thorns damage possible. Now here is where we get the new golden standards for kill speed against P8 Diablo. Once we realized that we could always get him to attack our Golem, we looked at a lot of different options here for what would get the best kill speed. We tried out an Act 3 static mercenary just using the Bramble rune word, so lower Thorns damage, but being able to cast static was like him having access to a more effective crushing blow. Sample kill speed with a small sample was looking at about 32 seconds. So not as good as the golden standard, slightly better than the Act 2 mercenary without Fire Golem, but we were getting to something better. Act 1 mercenary using the same Thorns setup and using Fire Golem to generate threat versus the Act 2 Thorns Aura mercenary with the same setup of summons and Fire Golem to gain threat. Both of these were getting close to 26 seconds. I think ultimately, given enough testing, the Act 2 mercenary would get a better output since he also has access to Crushing Blow here. But it just really goes to show the fact that these numbers are so close that the generating threat and getting the highest Thorns damage possible out of Diablo doing damage to himself is really the highest weighted increase in overall DPS and kill speed that we got. Now this test right here was very, very interesting because it went to highlight something incredibly important. Thorns damage is equal to the damage dealt to the target. If your character could be amped, so have cursed applied to him, even have decrepify applied to him, they will take more damage. This is what we were trying to abuse with the Bone Break, reducing our physical damage reduction. Going through Chaos Sanctuary, you are quite often either decrept or amped when you kill off the last boss seal. And on top of that, it lasts long enough that you can actually go into the fight with Diablo with amplified damage still up. In a kind of haphazard run where we were still just trying to figure out whether or not Might Aura plus Bramble on an Act 2 Mercenary was the best, we got amped right before the fight and we walked in and we got a staggering 23-second kill on Diablo. This was with using Fire Golem to be able to generate threat. So the Fire Golem had negative 100 physical damage reduction, and then on top of that was generating threat, getting hit for 4 times damage because of unit modifier, and then having a level 20 Thorns Aura from our mercenary. So that's about 1000% damage return. And this is something that I think goes a long way to help increase the argument strength for what I'm about to show you next. And that is, how effective is Thorns damage against something that isn't a boss? The reason why that question is so important to answer is because bosses are the ones who are going to get that unit modifier damage increase. Base monsters are only doing their base damage against your summons. There's no real tomfoolery there. Thorns Aura scales with difficulty. If you're up against a fanaticism pack of monsters, Cursed applying amp damage to your summons, Might Aura from monsters as well. You're up against really high physical damage builds like Death Lords that are also champions, so they're Berserker Death Lords. Everything in the game that increases the physical damage component of a monster that you're fighting is actually just increasing the Thorns damage that you do against them. So where did we bring this into to be able to test the varying differences in potential between Might and Thorns? Players 8 cows. The reason why Players 8 cows is so important for this testing is because it brings two big things to the table. One, monsters that have good physical damage reduction. Two, do a lot of damage on their melee attacks. And 3, on high player settings, have a large pool of health. The other side of it, though, is that you also get to revive the cows, which gain you access to very powerful monsters to apply Might Aura to. So this is arguably the fairest way of coming to understand the relationship between Might and Thorns Aura, because not only are the monsters highly resistant to this damage, but also do a good amount of damage themselves. So once you have Revive army of 20 plus cows, you really see the max benefit of Might Aura, and it still pales in comparison to the benefit that Thorns Aura brings to the build. So let's start with our first test. This was trying to set up the golden standard of tests. It was a base Act 2 Might Mercenary. It was using Fire Golem to generate threat. It was summoning Revive cows, and it was against Players 8 cows going at what I consider to be the optimal speed of me chaining together corpse explosions while we went. That run took us just under 4 minutes, so 3 minutes and 54 seconds for a full clear, killing every cow on the map. We then went and looked at using an Act 2 Mercenary, but swapping over to Thorns Aura. Still using Fire Golem to generate threat, still using Revived Cow summons, Amplify damage and Corpse Explosion was part of the kit, and you'll see that we slightly outperformed Pure Might. It was just about 6 seconds. We actually ran this twice because I accidentally ran this again, and I actually got a 3-minute and 20-second finish time on it. But even just swapping over to Thorns and not messing with anything else brought about a slightly faster average time than just using Might Aura, which was ultimately what I thought the data was going to show. One of the problems on a Corpse Explosion Necromancer is that while the monster's life on Players 8 scales up to 4.5 times their base total, Corpse Explosion damage is only ever calculated off of the monster's base value. So while the monster have 4.5 times their life, you're not doing 4 times damage with Corpse Explosion itself. It takes longer to get the first kill on the monster, and then you need to Corpse Explode more times to be able to kill a pack. My idea was that by including Thorns Aura, monsters who are doing 50% increased damage on Players 8 are going to be hitting themselves for so much more damage that once you start Corpse Exploding, they're already buttered up, and it's going to require less corpses to be able to get the same effect. But then that led us to our last test, which was combining together Might Aura with Bramble armor onto our Mercenary. And then the stat that should really help to highlight this as much as possible was when we actually combined Might Aura with Bramble armor, giving us a level 20 Thorns Aura. You'll see that we were nearly 30 seconds faster than just using Might Aura with a Fortitude alone, and we were over 20 seconds faster than running just Thorns. Now, why is this so important? That Might Aura, once you have 20 plus cows and your Mercenary itself being the major source of proactive DPS, is really going to help get that first body down on the ground. But the Bramble comes in to help butter up the monsters so that you have to Corpse Explode less to finish off the pack. It's the perfect melding of the two worlds. Now, that being said, without our revives, the Might Aura on the Mercenary is almost completely irrelevant. Sure, it slightly increases his damage potential, but your skeletons really aren't going to do anything. It's only once you have enough bodies to apply Might Aura to that you start to get a greater efficiency out of it than just the Thorns Aura alone. That being said, Might Aura Mercenary running Bramble for the increased damage in the area around you from all the cows hitting you is drastically outperforming running one of either of the other two auras. Now, this is a lot. It's a lot of numbers on a page. I tried to build two different graphs that I think go to highlight the comparative strength difference as you progress through the game for Might Aura, Thorns Aura, and then ultimately running both together by putting a Bramble on a Might Aura Mercenary. So So starting with our first graph where we're looking at the effectiveness versus density. This is how a Might Aura Mercenary or a Thorns Aura Mercenary, and then eventually when you can run both of them, will compare against each other at different states of progression throughout the game. We are using our arbitrary power scale of bad to best, and the first thing to note is that Might will always be blue, Thorns will always be yellow, and then Might plus Thorns will always be this teal color. The reason why I would argue in the earliest stages of normal in Nightmare that Might is going to outperform Thorns is because at those points, the Thorns Aura from the Mercenary is going to be very weak. You are able to run Iron Maiden along with it to buff up that damage. You need to swap between that and amp damage for Corpse Explosion, and eventually you can just end up running your own Edge Rune Word on the Necromancer itself. Also in normal in Nightmare, monsters aren't going to do as much damage, but when you have a large density of monsters all swinging at your skeleton simultaneously, even as early as Nightmare, Thorns starts to compete a lot with Might Aura as far as the overall DPS that it's bringing outside of your Mercenary. At some point late into Nightmare and into Hell, Thorns Aura actually begins to outperform Might. We saw that time and again, it outperformed Might straight out, just being able to run the Aura on the Mercenary itself. While Might Aura is static, so its effectiveness doesn't really drop, its effectiveness in comparison to Thorns or the Might Thorns combo is why you see a dip in Hell and Hell Best in slot. And then obviously Might and Thorns is not something that is available in normal and Nightmare. Arguably you could run the Might Mercenary yourself and run an Edge Rune Word on your character, but what we're really talking about is being able to put a Bramble onto your Act 2 Mercenary. And that's why it's only really relevant once you walk into Hell difficulty, but Hell Best in slot, we saw that that also helped to increase overall clear speed on Players 8 difficulty. And that's why, in comparison, it is outperforming both of them at that progression point. Something really important to take out from this graph is just how valuable Thorns is even on lower gear. Might Aura is something that is going to only scale along with the weapon damage that your Mercenary has available. So the better weapon that you have, the better Might is in amplifying its damage. But if you don't have a good Merc weapon, Thorns' returned damage is going to be constant since that's based off of the monsters and their potential damage output. This also means that on lower player settings where you're typically earlier in your progression where you can't really farm on anything higher than players 1, Might Aura is going to do more than good enough. It's going to help to drop that first body super fast and then you'll get your Corpse Explosion going off. But this is really looking at anything above players 1 settings where the builds typically start to struggle, especially on early game gear. Now, the graph for verse bosses is where you start to see just how much more aggressive the benefit from Thorns and then the combination of Thorns Might can really be. Verse bosses, Might Aura will increase the damage of your Mercenary. It won't really increase the damage of your summons because they very often will not be able to hit the boss in most circumstances until you're on much better gear. Once you're in Hell, I'd argue that the Mercenary is probably able to stay alive in most scenarios, but comparatively speaking, it has started to decline in efficiency as far as how much damage output you're gaining from it. And then once we're talking about Hell Best in slot gear, Might Aura continues to fall off. For people who don't know, the best way to kill bosses on a Necromancer is literally to sit there with a Thorns Aura, which you actually can just generate using Iron Maiden, and a Golem. So in normal, the best way to kill a boss, Blood Golem plus Iron Maiden. In Nightmare, the best way to kill a boss, Blood Golem plus Iron Maiden. In Hell, where we're using this data to help support this, while it is not as strong as in normal in Nightmare, in Hell difficulty, the monsters also do more damage. That means that your Thorns Aura is going to do more damage. And at this point, you could actually have an Act 2 Mercenary using Thorns Aura in addition to either Amplify or Iron Maiden, and this will still be the best way to kill a boss. But on Best in Slot gear, compared to using Might plus Bramble for Thorns, it does fall off slightly. And then here again, because it's not really available in normal in Nightmare, it really can't be compared. But the moment that you have access to it in Hell difficulty, you're getting the best of both worlds, where your summons and any revives that you might have are benefiting from Might Aura. But since you can manipulate things to attack your summons intentionally, it's going to outperform just plain Thorns. And then on Best in Slot gear, while it stays the same, everything else comparatively has become less strong, but it is absolutely the best way of getting the fastest clear speed against a boss kill time. Now, there are a couple things to think about that I just want people to remember that we did consider. One, when you're using a clay golem, the clay golem will slow down monsters. This will decrease their damage output from thorns. While on earlier gear, you're probably going to be using a clay golem. I think once you're at the point of having Enigma, most people have swapped over to iron golem with insight or pride if you're really rich. And that golem actually will not generate threat over your Act 2 mercenary. So there's something to be said about the fact that using a fire golem to be able to actively generate threat, especially on boss kill speed, will outperform either clay golem or iron golem. And that's it. That's the last bit of research that I'm going to do on this topic for the community. What I would love to see is other people test these similar scenarios and tell me what your findings were. Because at this point, I really can't see an argument for using Might Aura once you can consistently survive with Thorns Aura. And the numbers just support the fact that Might Aura itself is not the best in slot merc option. But let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you. I know I've put out a lot of videos on this topic, but it's something that I felt like really needed to be explored. And I think we finally had the data to prove the points that my initial gut feelings were leading me towards. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.